Revelation 17 and verse 2. It says, "With whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication." Now, verse 1 helps to fill in the context. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with this great whore known as Babylon the Great of Revelation 17 and verse 5. So that would indicate to us that the kings of the earth, or we would call them political powers or political leaders, have joined together with this great apostate church. Now, Babylon the Great, all the reformers understood. Martin Luther, John Knox, John Calvin, Zwingli from Switzerland, Wesley from England. We could go on and on. John Huss, Jerome from Czechoslovakia. All of them understood who the great whore of Revelation 17 was. They all understood that that was the Roman Catholic Church system. So Revelation 17:2 tells us then that the kings or the leaders of the earth and their nations have joined together with the Roman Catholic Church. Now, if we were to go back 500 years to the 16th century, and we were looking at England in the time of Henry VIII, and in the time of one of his daughters, Queen Elizabeth, who reigned from 1558 to 1603, Revelation 17:2 would be an utterly shocking passage of Scripture. Because at that time in England's history, England was separating themselves, they were divorcing themselves from the papal power. But Revelation 17:2 states that there would come a time in the history of our world when England would be reunited with the papacy. Take another nation, take Germany in the 16th century. And Martin Luther, through the Protestant Reformation, created the greatest chasm that a man could do by the power of God between Germany and Rome, between Protestant principles and Catholic principles. But you read Revelation 17:2 and you say, from the 16th century down to the 21st century, the last 500 years, something terrible has happened. In order for John the Revelator to say that at some point towards the end of Earth's history, the kings of the earth would be united with Rome. And that would include Germany. So you have England, you have Germany, you have Switzerland, who under Zwingli and Calvin in the 16th century broke away from Catholic principles. And we could go on and on to many different countries. You could come then to the United States. And America was founded on Protestant principles in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, where a man has the right to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. But Revelation 17:2 says there would come a time, even in the history of America, when this nation would be under the control of the papacy. Because Revelation 17:2 does not say, with whom some of the kings of the earth have committed fornication. It doesn't say that, does it? It says, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. It doesn't leave any out. What's that?
And the inhabitants of
And the inhabitants of the earth. That's right, Errol. So, something drastic happened from the 16th century and the Protestant Reformation down to right now. Something drastic and terrible has happened that has reunited these Protestant nations with Rome. Now, in Great Controversy, pages 234 and 235, Ellen White makes it very, very clear that there was an engine that was started in the 16th century called Jesuitism that was established with one purpose. And that purpose was to undo all that Protestantism had done and to reestablish papal supremacy in the world. So, folk, for that to happen in governments and for that to have happened in churches, which it has, all churches of today have been infiltrated by the Jesuit order and taken over by the Jesuit order. For that to have happened from the 16th century down to right now, we can say one thing. The Jesuit order of the Catholic Church has been very, very successful in their drive to destroy Protestantism and to reestablish the papacy in our world. And Revelation 17:2 tells us that. Now, I want to challenge each one of you in this room today because I've taken the challenge on myself as well. I challenge each one of you to take some country, any country in the world, and study its history. And see if you can't find the outworkings of the Great Controversy in that country. A war between Protestant principles and Catholic principles. Because that war has raged in every nation around this world. And Revelation 17:2 says that the papacy has won. I want to take a look this afternoon at a southern neighbor of the United States of America. A nation that from the very beginning of my childhood till many, many years, even a few years ago, I have looked upon that country and thought, I've asked myself, how could America be so rich? And how could a southern neighbor of ours, right on America's border, how could they be so terribly poor? Why is it today that the people of Mexico are coming across the borders from their homeland to the United States of America? Why? What has happened in Mexico that has made them so very, very poor and America so rich? And why are they trying to come into America today? And I want to take a look with you this afternoon for a little while. And I want you to understand something, that none of these behind the door tapes, thanks Paul, none of these behind the door tapes are an all in all. Because in these tapes we scratch the surface. That's what we do, we scratch the surface. So I would encourage all of you to get out some good history books. I went to my local library and I found this book, and I'm going to be quoting a lot from it today. It's called Fire and Blood, A History of Mexico. Secular library, pulled it right off the shelf. And folk, this book from a secular author tells of the great controversy struggle that's gone on in Mexico. This book. I read another book, and it was called The Horizons Concise History of Mexico by Fehrenbach. Same thing. It's all there. It's all there. Mexican history. Back in about the 10th or 11th century, about 1,000 years ago, there was a man who the Mexican people called Quetzalcoatl. And this man, and I probably am butchering his name, but this man, along with others, landed on the east coast of Mexico out by the area of the Yucatan Peninsula. This man was light-skinned, blue-eyed, and light hair. Obviously, he was a Northern European. They were exploring. They came into the area of the Caribbean, and they ended up on the country of what we know of today as Mexico. This fair-skinned god, as the Mexican people called this man, helped the Mexicans with their agriculture. He explained to them about the calendar, about the rising of the sun, about how to figure days and weeks and months and years. And he also helped the Mexican people with worship of God, or at least the God of this European. After a while, the local priests of Mexico at that time became very angry at Quetzalcoatl's influence with the Mexican people. And so the priests drove this man, this fair-skinned god, away from Mexico. But as Quetzalcoatl left, he promised that one day he would return and take over the land of Mexico for good. From the 10th and 11th century down to the 16th century, from that time down to the 16th century of the 1500s, the Mexican people worshipped a sun god called Huitzilopochtli. That was the name of the Aztec sun god. The Mexicans were sun worshippers for centuries. Now, from the Tower of Babel, we need to understand that at the Tower of Babel, the people had rejected the Creator. And so what is the most powerful element in the universe that people would replace instead of worshiping the Creator God? The sun. That's right. And so the Babel builders at the Tower of Babel were sun worshipers. And from the Tower of Babel, many of Noah's descendants went down. Mizraim's descendants went in to Egypt. Shem's went into the northeast, and Ham into the west and into the northwest. Well, some of the Babel builders, after a time, made their way across the ocean and ended up in the Western Hemisphere. Now, from the Tower of Babel, we know that most of those people were sun worshippers because Stonehenge was built in England, and the Druids, or the people that built Stonehenge, it was in order to worship the sun god. We know that people in Rome and in other places around Europe, the Mediterranean Sea, they were also sun worshippers. The Pantheon was built in honor of the sun and in order for the people to worship the sun. So the Mexican people just adopted what all the other Babel builders had adopted as well, and that was sun worship and how they did worship the sun in Mexico. I read repeatedly in their stories, this is what they did. When the sun would rise up in the morning, the Mexican people would rejoice because it was showing great power as it rose up into the sky. And so the Mexican people looked on the rising of the sun and said, "Oh, great, the sun has great power." But as the sun then started to fall in the western sky and disappear, the Mexican people became very frightened. And their priest said, "The sun has become very, very weak. That is why it is sinking in the sky." And so what did they do? They instituted a service where the only way that the Mexican people and the priests could be sure that the sun would rise the next day is if they would feed the sun human hearts. And as they would feed the sun on this altar in Tenochtitlan, which is now Mexico City, on their main altar there in the heart of Mexico City, they would say the sun is going to get strong. It's going to get stronger because we're feeding the sun human hearts. Now let me tell you, where did they get human hearts? They had to sacrifice people. Many, many people, not on a weekly or a monthly or a year. This was every single day. Now, from the accounts I read, what they would do, and I'm not even going to say it. Obviously, there were human sacrifices. They had to tear open the sternum, pull out the heart, and actually offer the heart right there on the altar. In order for the people of Mexico, the Aztecs of Tenochtitlan, what they would do is they would go around and conquer the various tribes of Mexico. And part of the payment of these tribes to the Aztecs was to give them people. And they would then take those people and they would be used as human sacrifices to feed their sun god. You can imagine after that went on for a very, very short amount of time how the other tribes of Mexico began to feel about the Aztecs. They hated them. Suffice to say, it was an extremely sickening, grotesque, and terrible form of worship. But that's what the priests of Mexico led the Mexican people in for centuries. From an internet article, it's from www.cybertraveler.org/Mexican history. This is what it said in there from this website. It says, "I was the Aztec sun god and I had a voracious appetite. The Aztecs worshipped me above all the other gods. They built their largest pyramid in the center of Tenochtitlan in my honor. And there atop the temple they sacrificed hundreds of people a day in service to me. Like all the ancient Mesoamerican, the Mexican peoples, the Aztecs were obsessed with time. They watched me rise in the morning with great relief and set in the evening with grave concern. Seeing how weak I was at day's end led their priests to believe that I was anemic. If I didn't rise again in the morning, time would stop and the world would end. Thus they fed me a constant diet of human hearts. And then it says, the Aztecs built a warrior society that was organized for conquest, which proved more human tribute for me and coincidentally more treasure for them. That's what I was going to say. When the Aztecs would go out and fight these tribes throughout Mexico, the greatest honor they could bring to the Aztec people was to bring back as many captives as possible. Not dead, but captive, living people. because they wanted to offer them on the altar to their sun god. It says, the captives were well fed before they came to me. At last they were walked up the steps of my pyramid, where they were greeted by priests bearing well-sharpened obsidian knives. 4 priests would hold down a captive. The 5th would cut open his chest, remove the beating heart, and offer it to me. It never occurred to them to just buy me an alarm clock. Okay, the guy's just joking there. Folk, this went on for centuries, and you can imagine the superstition and the fear of the people of Tenochtitlan, or of the Aztecs. They had that to contend with. They were in absolute dreaded fear of the priests. And they also had that legend about that fair-skinned god who would someday return, Quetzalcoatl, who would come from somewhere over in the east and would come back and reclaim power and take over the Aztec Empire for good. Well, in 1519, the leader of the Aztecs at that time, probably most of us remember learning about him in school, his name was Montezuma. He was the leader of the Aztecs. His city was Tenochtitlan, which is today Mexico City. It was in 1519 that the Spanish arrived, and the leader or the conquistador of the Spaniards was a man by the name of Hernando Cortez. Cortez had been in Cuba from 1504 to 1519, but he had learned about a golden city and a country of great gold to the west. And so Cortez set off with not too many men and about 15 ships and headed towards what we know of today as Mexico. When Cortez arrived with his men, with horses, with muskets that the tribes of Mexico had never seen, they were convinced that Hernando Cortez was the fair-skinned god that had come to reclaim his control of Mexico. And so everywhere Cortez went, he started in the Yucatan, he went to Veracruz, and then he started making his way to the capital of Tenochtitlan. Before Cortez started on his trip inland, he had all of his ships burned, because he was not going to be turning around. Now, Hernando Cortez brought with him muskets, he brought horses, but Hernando Cortez brought something else with him to the land of Mexico. And what he brought to the land of Mexico, and what all Spanish and Portuguese explorers brought with them, was something that would change and would control and form the history of Mexico from the 16th century all the way down to today. Hernando Cortez brought with him Roman Catholicism. Hernando Cortez was a devout Roman Catholic, if you want to call it that. He believed in the church. And in this book, Fire and Blood, A History of Mexico, by a secular author, he says on page 119 and 120, he says this: Cortez struck down all the native idols he could find and ordered the company to erect a great cross and an icon to the Virgin Mary in the village center. He commanded the chaplain, there were priests, official and otherwise, with every Spanish party, to convert the village population and then say Mass. Padre Bartolomé de Olmedo held Mass and also claimed a general conversion. Page 120 says, Cortez was immensely more enlightened and religious than the normal conquistador. He was honest in his desire to create a new Christian kingdom in the Indies. But what he accomplished, and there's no doubt that he knew this, by his various acts of conversion and piety, was not to save the Indians, but to enlist the God of the Spaniards in his cause, at least in Spanish minds. Now, did you notice what this author said? As a secular author, he said he was honest in his desire to create a new Christian kingdom in the Indies. Now, what does that author mean when he says to create a new Christian kingdom? Is it a kingdom that's going to follow the teachings of Scripture? Is it a kingdom that's going to follow the principles of the Bible as Martin Luther was teaching? No. It means he was going to set up a Roman Catholic hierarchy in Mexico. There was nothing Christian about it, but in secular writings today, on U.S. News and World Report, Time Magazine, news, all the media today will tell you that the Christian church of the Dark Ages was Rome. And you'll even see that in Seventh-day Adventist periodicals. Mervyn Maxwell's tremendous books, God Cares, Volume 1 and 2. Tremendous material. But how he, as a Seventh-day Adventist historian, could call the Catholic Church of the Dark Ages Christian is beyond me. George Vandeman has done it in his book, The Rise and Fall of the Antichrist. Insanity. Hernando Cortez was there to make Mexico Catholic. Now, Montezuma in the capital had sent runners out to the coast to see this fair-skinned god, Quetzalcoatl. And Montezuma believed that Hernando Cortez was the red-skinned, blue-eyed god who was coming back after 1,000 years to retake over Mexico. Montezuma sent Cortez many presents, hoping that Cortez would accept the presents and leave. But he didn't. Cortez kept coming towards the city of Tenochtitlan. I want to read to you what Cortez saw when he arrived at Tenochtitlan. And once again, this is modern-day Mexico City. But it's changed an awful lot in 500, 400 years. This is taken from John Tarleton's brief, and he calls it Irreverent History of Mexico, page 6. It's also on the internet website, www.cybertraveler.org/Mexican history. It says this, and this is Cortez. We marched from what is now Veracruz to Mexico City and arrived on the outskirts of Tenochtitlan, November of 1519. What I saw when we crossed over the mountain pass and gazed down upon the valley below was the most breathtaking sight I had ever seen. A great city with more people than any European city of that age. It was built on a series of man-made islands in the middle of a crystal clear lake. They grew their food in the water using elaborate hydroponic gardens. The air above the city was clear and freshly scented by pine trees. The great city shimmered in the sunlight as if it were made of pure gold. And for Hernando Cortez, when he saw that, what do you think he had in mind? He wanted to completely ravage Tenochtitlan of all their gold. He wanted to take it over for himself and for Rome. Cortez, as the god who had come from Europe, Montezuma almost worshipped Cortez as he came into Mexico City. And Cortez and his men basically did whatever they wanted in Tenochtitlan. They gathered gold, they created disturbances, they caused troubles. Finally, there's conflicting reports, but Cortez had Montezuma arrested and confined in his own palace. And after a riot and some trouble in Mexico City, Montezuma was killed. The city was ravaged by fighting and bloodshed. Cortez, many of his men tried to escape out of Mexico City because they were horribly outnumbered. And the people realized that they weren't gods at all. They were greedy, whoremongering men. And so they had a terrible battle. Many of Cortez's men died as they tried to swim across to the mainland, and they were weighed down with so much riches and gold, they drowned in the water. And so there was a terrible bloodshed in this beautiful city of Tenochtitlan. Well, Cortez escaped. 2 years later, in 1521, Hernando Cortez, with more men from other surrounding tribes who hated the Aztecs, came back to Mexico City and defeated them, and by so doing, took over Mexico. To whom did Hernando Cortez give credit for the victory? From John Tarleton's brief, irreverent history of Mexico, page 7, Cortez, though outnumbered, we triumphed with the aid of superior technology and the Virgin Mary, whose standard we followed into battle. Now, does that not sound like another man about 12 centuries before, by the name of Constantine, who in the name of seeing a cross in the sky went forward to battle and took over the world in the 4th century for the Catholic Church? August 13, 1521, Tenochtitlan fell to Hernando Cortez's army. The great city and its fabulous empire became the Spanish. We gave thanks and claimed it in the name of the King of Spain and Christendom, or in other words, the Roman Catholic Church. This is from another internet article, www.mexican/embassy.dk/history. Page 3, it's an article entitled Mexican History and Culture. It says, while Hernando Cortez consummated the conquest, the Franciscan and Dominican monks brought Christianity and European civilization and culture to the country. In 1523, Friar Pedro de Gante founded the first school for the indigenous population, the School of San Jose, where languages and arts were taught. The construction of the first cathedral of the American continent began in Mexico City in 1530. Now I ask you, in the first school, and let's understand the historical time frame, 1521, when Montezuma and Tenochtitlan fell to Hernando Cortez. What was going on in Europe? 1521. Now think for a moment. Reformation. It was in 1521 that Martin Luther said, "Here I stand, I can do no other." There was a revolution going on in Europe between Protestantism and Catholicism. So when the Franciscan and Dominican monks brought Christianity and started a school for the Mexican people, what were they teaching the people of Mexico? They were teaching them Roman Catholicism. And what were they teaching them about Protestantism? They were teaching the people of Mexico to despise and hate Protestantism. There was a religious war that was erupting on the continent of Europe at this very time that the Franciscan and Dominican monks were bringing Catholicism to Mexico. Schools, as you notice, that they were started right after the conquest. So within 10 years, there were a Catholic school and a Catholic church already being raised up. And 10 years after Cortez had conquered Mexico, the Aztecs, and they were the most powerful tribe, guess who appeared to a young Mexican young man one afternoon? The Virgin of Guadalupe. That's right. And so, folk, all the way back, almost 500 years ago, the cult or the demon Mary, the demon impersonating Mary, had already infiltrated into the hearts and minds of the people of Mexico. Almost 500 years ago, spiritualism and all its attending horrors were being hoisted on the people of Mexico. In John Tarleton's brief Irreverent History of Mexico, page 10, this is the account. It says, and these are little blurbs where he has the person speaking, and then you've got to guess who it is. Well, this is the Virgin of Guadalupe, and it says this: I first appeared in Mexico in December of 1531 to the humble Indian peasant Juan Diego. The Bishop of Mexico City didn't believe Juan Diego's story, so the next time I appeared before Juan Diego, I sent him along with a bundle of yellow roses, which never grow during that time of year. When Juan Diego unrolled the roses in front of the bishop, he discovered that my image had been emblazoned on his white shawl, and it was a miracle. The bishop was convinced at last. He promptly followed my command to build a shrine at Tepeyac, where I had appeared to Juan Diego. This was formerly a holy site for Tenochtitlán, the Aztec goddess of childbirth. Nowadays, my image can be found not only in every church, but in bus stations, marketplaces, restaurants, as well as in millions of homes. When someone falls ill or has a dying relative or desperately needs to win the lottery, they pray to me first and remember to leave a modest donation at any one of my thousands of shrines. 500 years ago, folks, the Catholic Church, the devil was dead on serious to destroy the southern neighbors of the United States, which was not even discovered at that time. Well, yeah, I guess Amerigo Vespucci did it around 1507. But as for colonizing, we're still many, many decades into the future. But already in 1531, the demon of the Virgin Mary appears, and now shrines are everywhere in Mexico. Page 182 of Fire and Blood. And the author of that book, by the way, is T.R. Fehrenbach. Okay, Fehrenbach wrote that one. Fire and Blood, History of Mexico. Page 182, the millions of villagers scattered throughout the civilized highlands acquiesced to Spanish rule in what proved to be one of the most decisive conquests recorded. There was not to be a single serious rebellion against the Spanish within the old Mexica Empire for 3 centuries. Folk, for 300 years. For 300 years. Roman Catholicism strangled the country of Mexico. Page 204 of Fehrenbach's book, Fire and Blood, History of Mexico, page 204, it says, the work of the sword was followed immediately by the labors of the friars. In a direct continuation of the dreams of Cortez, the missionary effort in Spanish America, Mexico, was the one thing that kept the lordship of Spain from becoming just another ephemeral imperial venture. Spain's free hand in the New World gave governors, bishops, and missionaries a chance to change America forever, to make America Catholic. This era coincided with the greatest flowering of Hispanic civilization, the time of Spanish hope and power and glory, from the reigns of the Catholic kings to the abdication of Charles of Ghent. The priests and teaching brothers planted 2 roots of culture, language and religion, imperishably in the native populations. Thus they changed the very environment forever in the New World. The efforts of the mission system were a failure, must be described as a failure, but only in the sense of the system's self-imposed goals of making fully Europeanized, fully equal subjects of the Amerindians. This did not happen for a host of reasons, some historic and some human. But the work of the missionaries was to prove more effective in the long run than the work of soldiers, merchants, or conquistadors. Why? Why is Mexico what Mexico is? Why has it been so poor? Why are the people there with nothing as far as material things? Because the Catholic Church in any country in which they have gone in and their generals have been successful, there is always a 2-party system. There are the extremely wealthy, and there are the very, very poor. And we see that played out in the history of Mexico. Page 257 of Fehrenbach's book, 257 and 258, he says this, the religious orders entered into the hacienda system. The Jesuits, who arrived late in Mexico, from what I have been able to deduce, the Franciscans and Dominicans came in the 1520s. The Jesuit order was not created till the 1540s. The first Jesuit missionaries were in Mexico in the 1560s. As the ink was drying on the final agreements made at the Council of Trent in 1563, there were already Jesuit missionaries heading over to Mexico. The Jesuits who arrived late in Mexico bought lands and seemed to have been especially efficient in management. However, the older orders, with their original mission largely completed, became sterile. The orders and the secular church, which entered Mexico in the 17th century, collecting the Indio tithes, rapidly became wealthy. In a pious, death-conscious, superstitious Mexico, all branches of the church were deluged with gifts and bequests. This was an old evil in the Mediterranean church. Now in Mexico, the immortal institution's wealth could not be alienated or taxed. And soon it became the largest landowner and landlord in New Spain. This was extremely unhealthy for both the economy and the church itself. Did you hear what that said? The Catholic Church, in a very, very short amount of time, became the wealthiest and the most powerful landlord in all of Mexico. Church property was not well managed on the whole, and clerics presiding over ever-growing wealth became tinged with avarice. That means greed. The church, which itself had done so much to destroy the banking ethos in Spain, now let plentiful money at extremely low rates and required principal to be repaid only at the debtor's death. In the profligate Criollo society, this policy produced more wealth for the church. By the 1630s, as Thomas Gage saw and recorded, the missionary orders had largely turned from serving and protecting the Indios, which are the local population, to living extravagantly off them. The Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, Carmelites, and Jesuits had erected 400 convents by 1600. In 80 years, they had erected 400 convents. That's 5 a year for 80 years. Let's see. These no longer served any real social or economic purpose, but they had to be supported by native sweat. Many of the friars had become pervasively lazy and corrupt. They spent nights drinking and gambling with cards and dice, finding various legalistic pretexts to evade their vows. Felipe IV, in effect, secularized the Mexican church by turning over the collection of Indio tithes. Every subject paid 10% of his income into the church. That was required by law. If the Indios had no money, they paid with portions of their crops or goats or chickens to the secular clergy. The established orders, however, remained ensconced in Mexico, very jealous of each other and of their privileges. Despite the fact that the church as a body was rich and that it collected tithes and retained 8/9 of these, 1/9 going to the crown. In Mexico, high fees were demanded for every service. The clergy refused to perform marriages, baptisms, or burials except at exorbitant cost. In other words, the people of Mexico were raped by the Catholic Church. Page 288, and it still is going on today. Page 288, Fire and Blood. The church had lost all sense of mission. Its dominant mood was blackness, portrayed over every altar by stark images of bleeding Christ and tortured saints. Thousands upon thousands of hooded penitents marched through the streets of Mexico on holy days. Flagellants beat themselves until the blood ran. The missions had failed, but idle friars walked the palaces with their whores and seduced virgins to the confessional. Spanish Catholicism had lost all ethic, retreated into ritual and mysticism. Whores wore crucifixes, and murderous bandits carried images of the Virgin around their necks. Nothing was demanded of the Christian except observance, but that ferociously. Nothing was unpardonable but free thought or heresy. That went on, folks, from 1521 to the early 1800s. For nearly 3 centuries, the Mexican people were ground down to dust. And they were slaves to the powerful Spanish leaders and the Catholic Church. Now, I want you to understand the time frame here, and we're going to have a part 2 on this next month. When you go from 1521 to almost 300 years later, you're going to come down to about 1800. Now I want you to think in your minds for a moment, what was going on right around 1800? What was going on? Think about it. There were 2 revolutions that had been fought within about a span of 25 years before 1800. Where was one of those revolutions fought? One was fought in Europe in a country called what? France. And another revolution had been fought in another place called what? It was called, the United States or, North America. The ideas of these 2 revolutions began to go around the world. Now you remember in 1814, a Congress was held in Vienna, Austria. And it was held there by the leaders of Europe, Pope Pius VII, and the Jesuit order. And they met there in Vienna in 1814, and their one great concern was this. There are ideas in our world today that people are establishing where human beings have rights, and where governments have to be representative, and where the church and the state are separate. And you know what? Those monarchs of Europe and the Pope were scared to death. Because if those principles would win out, do you know what would happen to those people's thrones? They would be destroyed. And so at the Congress of Vienna in 1814, these monarchs said, we are going to destroy the principles of republicanism and Protestantism. Well, on page 308 of Fehrenbach's book, Fire and Blood, History of Mexico, he says this: the pamphlets issued from these upheavals, he's talking about the French Revolution and the American Revolution, circulated quite freely despite the opposition of the church. The North American Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution were on the Inquisition's index of forbidden tracts. Did you know that? The United States Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, those 2 documents were forbidden reading by the Catholic Inquisition. They forbade people to read those because they thought if people read those Protestant documents, they would become tinged with heresy. So they were forbidden tracts. Along with the writings of the French philosophers. But most educated people had seen them. In closing, folk, this aspect, and we'll pick up next month on part 2 of Mexican history. The Mexican people had a decision to make. They'd been controlled by the Spanish and the Catholic Church for 3 centuries. What would they do? There would be revolution because it was in the air, and there was revolution in Mexico throughout the 19th century. There was revolution. But which one would they accept? Would they embrace the principles of the French Revolution? Or would they embrace the principles of the American Revolution? And folk, there's a verse history. Because Revelation 18 and verse 1 talks about the loud cry, and we know that that is God's last attempt to give a final warning message to the inhabitants of the earth. And Revelation 17, of course, written as a book, it just follows right in line. So Revelation 17, the context, it's talking about things from 1798 down to the end of Earth's history. Now, Revelation 17 and verse 2, it says, with whom, and it's talking about the great whore, Babylon the Great, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Now, folk, Revelation 17 and verse 2 is talking about a time in Earth's history when there is not one king, there is not one kingdom or one nation on the face of this planet that is not in cahoots and under the control of the papacy, i.e. the Jesuit order. It says right there, Revelation 17 verse 2, and it is an all-inclusive statement, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. So Revelation 17 and verse 2 is talking about a time towards the end of Earth's history when every nation on the face of the earth will give their power and their strength into the hands of Rome and the Jesuit order. Now, folk, that's not something that happens overnight. Doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long period of time. Especially when you think about the great movement that began in the 16th century, basically, when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the door at Wittenberg. Martin Luther, under the power of God's hand, began a Protestant Reformation that was going to shake the very foundations of this entire world. And the principles of the Protestant Reformation, those principles God would allow to permeate into every nation. Because God would want every nation to have the opportunity to embrace the principles of the Protestant Reformation. Now, the principles of the Reformation, they go into the religious arena, they go into the political arena, and they go into the economic arena. The principles of the Protestant Reformation are not solely principles that affect a person's religion. It affected governments, and it affected the economic structure of nations. Before the Protestant Reformation, countries were run on the principle of tyranny or dictatorship. It was a king, and a king told his subjects what to do, period. That's how nations were run. And only one nation that I know of in history that dared to oppose that, and that was the British noblemen at Runnymede in 1215, when they wrote and forced King John to sign what they called the Magna Carta, or the Mighty Charter. That was the first nation that I have ever heard of in the last 1,000 years that embraced Protestant principles of government. And what those principles were this, is that people have certain inalienable civil rights, and that governments, Protestant governments, are governments of the people, by the people, and for the people. That's a Protestant government. That's how Protestantism plays into the political arena. In the religious arena, of course, man worships God according to the dictates of his own conscience. And no human being, no leader whatsoever has the right to interpose between God and a person. Now that's how the Protestant Reformation, in a real tiny nutshell, comes into the religious realm. Into the economic realm, the Protestant Reformation created a middle class. Because Martin Luther and the principles of the Reformation taught people that they had skills, that God had given them talents whereby they could make their living, and by what they did could better humanity and better themselves. And so out of the Protestant Reformation emerged a middle class. Through the Dark Ages, you had no middle class. It was the filthy rich and the awfully poor. It was the magistrate and it was the peasant. So the Protestant Reformation ran through all those lines: politics, religion, and economics. Well, the papacy, i.e. the Jesuit order, they were determined that those principles would be crushed. The Jesuit order was raised up in the early 1540s for the sole purpose of destroying every last thread of Protestantism in government, in church, and in economics. And of course, Revelation 17 and verse 2 shows us that the Jesuit order, as God has allowed it to happen, the Jesuit order at this stage of Earth's history has been completely successful. They have taken over every government, every leader on the face of this earth today. Bar none. They have taken over since 1980, according to Alberto Rivera, every church, organization on our planet is taken over by the Jesuit order today. Bar none. In Revelation chapter 13, verse 16 states, He causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark of the name of the beast or the number of his name. What does that tell you? If somebody from the top can determine who buys and who sells and who doesn't buy and who doesn't sell, well, who controls the economy of the world? They do. That's right. And so Revelation 13, verses 16 and 17 show us that the papacy/Jesuits' goal to completely destroy the economic inroads of Protestantism is successful at the end of Earth's history. Because that's what Revelation 13, 16, and 17 says. And what will heaven's response be? How will God respond to governments, churches, and economies that are totally arrayed against heaven and against His few chosen people? How will God respond to that? The Bible says, and I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with His glory. God is going to pour out power that's going to make the Protestant Reformation, it's going to make 1844 look like something that was done at a Sunday afternoon picnic. What is going to happen in the near future as God takes the field under the power of the Holy Spirit, the mightiest power in the universe, God will finish the Reformation. And the world will see that Protestant principles, that heaven's principles, are the only true and special things that we have. So there's going to be a titanic struggle in the near future between these two powers. Now today we're going to take a second look at Mexico and the history of Mexico since 1800. It's very fascinating because you can study the history of any nation on the face of this earth. Any nation. Haiti, Germany, Austria, Canada, Spain, Thailand, Japan. You can study the history of any nation. And in every nation, God has tried. And God has raised up men to bring Protestant principles, biblical principles, to that nation, to try to save that nation from Roman tyranny. And a titanic struggle has ensued in every nation on the face of this earth. All things considered, once this second book is done, you say, oh no, don't say it. Don't say it. After the last meeting last month, and I'm not going to blame myself for this one. It's all somebody else's fault. But somebody came up to me. They had the audacity to come up to me and they said, you know what? There ought to be a book out there that talks about how the papacy has sought to destroy Protestant principles in every country. And you know what I said to the person? I said, you know what? You're right. Now, would the culprits, would the instigator of that idea, please stand up. Let's kneel for prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for your word. Thank you that you try to help each one of us see that we can't count on anything else. Everything else runs through our hands like sand. Can't get a grip on it. Thank you for your word. It stands fast forever and ever. Thank you that we can step out and hold on to that word and it will never fail us. Thank you that it does what it says. Thank you that it's a person, Jesus Christ, who died to save each one of us. Please guide us as we study the history of Mexico, as you have tried to help this people of the Southland. Please guide us and grant us wisdom to understand so that we can share with people of Spanish descent and with every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, just a quick review of early Mexican history. The people of Mexico had a tradition. They believed that there had been a man by the name of Quetzalcoatl, and this man was a fair-skinned god, blue eyes, red beard, came from Europe. In the 10th century, came to Mexico, helped them with their agriculture, their calendar, their worship. The local priest drove this man out of Mexico, but he vowed that he would return. The people of Mexico were predominantly sun worshippers. They worshiped the sun. They had a terrible cult where they believed that when the sun would rise up in the morning, that it was showing great strength, but as it started to go down in the afternoon, that it was starting to get weak. And so what the people of Mexico would do is they would begin to offer human sacrifices to the sun. And they would actually pull the hearts. In fact, the accounts I read, they would actually pull bleeding hearts. That's gory. Pull them right out of a person's chest and put it on the altar and offer it for food to their sun god. And then, of course, in the morning when the sun rose up, they would all be thanking the sun because they had provided it enough strength to rise up another day. So the Mexican people were sun worshippers. That went on for centuries. Finally, in the early 1600s, a man by the name of Hernando Cortez started west. He came from Cuba, went to Mexico, landed at Veracruz, and the Mexican people and the leader of Mexico, a man by the name of Montezuma, believed that Hernando Cortez was that long-lost European who was going to come back and take over Mexico. Cortez did eventually take over Mexico right around 1521. And for about the next 300 years, more or less, Mexico was completely controlled by the Spanish, and more specifically by the Church of Spain, which was the Roman Catholic Church. For 3 centuries, the tyranny, the religious intolerance, the cruelty, and the licentious worship of Rome consumed Mexico. That went on for nearly 300 years. But in the late 1700s, 2 great revolutions occurred. One occurred, of course, and the one we know about occurred in America. And the principles that the American Revolution fought for, and the principles that came out of the American Revolution were these. Number 1 was certain inalienable rights or freedoms for the people. And those were laid out in the Constitution, of which the Bill of Rights is a part of it. So one was liberty. Another one was Protestantism. Protestantism was that a man could worship God according to the dictates of his own conscience, in a nutshell. America was also a republic where people were granted rights and no man could ever take those rights away. Nobody could take them away, ever. And it was a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. That was the American Republic, the fruits that came out of the American Revolution. But in the late 1700s, there was another revolution that was fought. This one was based on very, very different principles. It was fomented by Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati, which were simply a front organization for the Jesuit order. The Jesuit order was behind the French Revolution. The principles of the French Revolution were very different from those that came out of the Protestant American Revolution. The principles of the French Revolution, it was not a republic, it was a democracy. You say, but wait a minute, Bill, I thought we have a democracy in America. No, we have a republic in America. A democracy is where the majority rules. It's mob rule. That's a democracy. So whoever has the biggest gun and shoots the cannonball the farthest, or has the plane that can drop the bombs most precisely, in a democracy, they're the rulers. That's a democracy. We are not a democracy. That idea came out of the French Revolution, and it then permeated into the writings of a Jesuit-led Jew by the name of Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto. And it was those principles of Karl Marx that he got from the French Revolution that paved the way for the 20th century abomination called communism. Communism, in its purest sense, is a democracy. Did you know that? Communism is a democracy. Because whoever's got the strongest people, they rule. That's a democracy. And that's what Lenin had in the Soviet Union or Russia. Another principle that came out of the French Revolution was equality. Democracy and equality. And under equality, everybody is treated the same under the law. So if I want to worship God according to the dictates of my conscience, and the President of the United States wants to worship God according to the dictates of his own conscience, if the law, that we're all equal, if the law says you can't, then we'll both be punished the same way. That's equality. It's not about rights. It's not about fairness. It's not about liberties. It's about everybody being treated the same way. If the people in power don't like you and they fabricate something against you, well, you can be eliminated whether you're a peasant or a middle class or an upper class person. That's equality under the French Revolution. The final thing was fraternity. And that simply means that everybody works and does what's best for everybody else. We don't do something because it's right. We don't do something because the God of heaven impresses us with it. We simply do something because everybody else thinks that it's best that we do it that way. So you do things for the common good of people. You say, Bill, why are you bringing this up? What does that have to do with Mexico? Well, you know what, folks? In Mexico, in the 19th century, the principles of the American Revolution and the principles of the French Revolution were going through a war in Mexico. And in fact, the principles of the American Revolution and the French Revolution were going through a war in America as well. Did you know that in America we have had 2 constitutions written? Folk, the principles of the first 12 amendments to our Constitution are based on the ideas of republic, liberty, and what was the third one? Protestantism. Those are the first 12 amendments. Following the Civil War, principles were admitted into our Constitution under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that were couched in the idea that the 4 million slaves that had been mistreated throughout several centuries in America, within those 3 amendments, the idea was couched, oh, we're going to give freedom to the slaves now. We're going to bring equality for them. But in actuality, folk, under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, a new Constitution was written. I want to read a statement to you. This is taken from a book called Our Secret Constitution by George P. Fletcher, Oxford University Press, written in 2001. This man is a constitutional scholar, professor of jurisprudence at Columbia University. He said this: the Civil War called forth a new constitutional order. At the heart of this postbellum legal order lay the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, ratified in the years 1865 to 1870. The principles of this new legal regime are so radically different from our original Constitution that they deserve to be recognized as a second American Constitution. The new Constitution established, in fact, a second American Republic. The first Constitution was based on the principles of people as a voluntary association, individual freedom, and Republican elitism. The guiding premises of the Second Constitution were organic nationhood, equality of all persons, and democracy. These are principles radically opposed to each other. The principles that came into America under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are the same principles that came out of the French Revolution. Democracy, as Fletcher said, which is mob rule; equality, everyone treated the same; and fraternity, where we all work for the common good. The Second Constitution of the Second American Republic rested upon organic nationhood, equality of all persons, and popular democracy. Hardly anyone in America realizes that Marxism sees itself as resting upon the most advanced form of democracy and equality. With this understanding, the professor's analysis that the Second Constitution is radically opposed to the first, we can safely say that the Second American Constitution rested upon principles of communism that are at war with the original 1787 Constitution and Bill of Rights. This went on in Mexico in the 1800s, and I'd like to take a look at 2 people. One's name was a priest who was trained. His name was Miguel Hidalgo. He was trained by the Jesuits. He was a widely read individual. I want to read you something about him. Miguel Hidalgo, in the early 1800s, started a revolution in Mexico. Page 316 of the book Fire and Blood, it says Hidalgo had been trained at the Jesuit college at Valladolid, which was in Spain, and had later instructed seminarians. He was widely read in religion, Spanish, and foreign literature. In fact, he had a great fondness for French writings and ideas. That's very, very interesting. In the revolution that Miguel Hidalgo brought about in Mexico in the early 1800s, through that revolution, the Spanish were thrown out of Mexico. The principles that Hilgaldo laid out were the same ones identified under the French Revolution. Everybody did things for the common good of everyone else. Everybody was equal. It was a democracy. But God in His mercy brought along somebody else. God brought along and raised up a man in Mexico that was the Mexicans' Abraham Lincoln. The man's name was Benito Juarez. Benito Juarez was a very diminutive individual, not very big, but the man packed a punch. He stood for principle. In a book, our website page, it's called www.mexconnect.com/mex/history. It says this: if we're looking for a true Lincoln from Mexico, one who resembled the emancipator in spirit as well as in his political role, it is instructive to look at the life and career of Benito Juarez. Lincoln was tall and angular. Juarez was short and stocky. Lincoln was of old American stock. Juarez was a full-blooded Indian. Both were born poor. Both cared more for political power than riches, and both believed that law was the best preparation for a political career. But they also stood on law as well. They never met. They formed a lifetime mutual admiration, and they helped each other whenever they could. From another book called The Horizon, Concise History of Mexico by Victor Alba, it says this about what Juarez did in Mexico. Most controversial, this is page 97 of Horizon's Concise History of Mexico. It says, most controversial was the law pushed through by Alvarez's Minister of Justice, Benito Juarez, who took direct aim at ecclesiastical and military privilege when he denied all special courts jurisdiction in civil matters. The Jesuits were suppressed. Then in June of 1856, the drastic Ley Lerdo law was passed. This law ordered that the Catholic Church divest itself of all lands not specifically devoted to religious functions, and that these lands be sold to existing tenants. You notice what Benito Juarez did in Mexico? He did three things. Number one, he passed a law that took a direct aim at the control of the Catholic Church and the property they owned in Mexico. That's one thing he did. Another thing he did was he made every Catholic priest and leader responsible to the law in Mexico. Prior to Juarez, the Catholic Church officials were immune and were not tried in Mexican courts of law. So Juarez said, no more of that. No more privileges under the law in Mexico. He then told the Catholic Church they had to sell all their lands that were not specifically devoted to religious functions. And third, he suppressed the Jesuit order. Now, what happened to Benito Juarez? Benito Juarez took power in Mexico. He became the president. right around 1860 as the Civil War was beginning in the United States. As a result of Benito Juárez's stand against the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church got three powers in Europe. They got England, France, and Austria. And Mexico owed money to those three European powers. But those three European powers were also controlled by Rome. And so these three European powers put great pressure on Juárez to pay back the monies that Mexico owed them. Well, those European powers and the Catholic Church knew that there was no way that Juárez could pay back the loans. And so the French, the English, and the Austrians, they all got together their army, their navy, and they headed towards Mexico because they were going to squash Benito Juárez. You say, well, that's justifiable. I mean, he wasn't paying back his loans. I mean, we don't condone not paying back what we owe. Well, of course we don't. However, Juárez was an honest man, and in time he would have paid back those debts. The fact is that the Jesuit order hated Benito Juárez because he had suppressed them and he had very, very much curbed the power of the Catholic Church. And so the French finally, the English and the Austrians backed away. The French kept coming, and the French put into power in Mexico. They ousted Benito Juárez, and they put into power an Austrian man by the name of Maximilian. And Maximilian was put into power in 1862 in Mexico. The Catholic Church hoped by having a French army in Mexico and the English up in Canada that then they could come down and help the Confederates and smash Abraham Lincoln and the Union forces. Well, Maximilian ran into trouble in Mexico. He didn't do everything the way that the Catholic Church wanted him to do. He didn't do exactly as he was told, and so the Catholic Church withdrew their support of Maximilian. And in 1867, Maximilian was killed. And in 1867, Benito Juárez came back into power in Mexico. For the next 5 years, Benito Juárez tried to create in Mexico a constitutional form of government, just like there had been in America. He limited the church's power. He tried to give money back to the Mexican people. 5 years into his attempt to bring Protestant principles to Mexico, Benito Juárez was poisoned to death, and he died in 1872. From 1872, with the death of Benito Juárez, a man who had once claimed and who had actually sided with Benito Juárez in bringing sound principles to Mexico came into office. His name was Porfirio Diaz. But unfortunately, Porfirio Diaz had become accustomed to American businesses investing in Mexico, and they had brought millions of dollars to the land of Mexico. And so as a result, the American dollar and the American businessman took over and began to exploit the Mexican people. And the principles of Benito Juarez began to die out. But once again, after Diaz had been in power for 30 years, till around the early 1900s, in 1917 there was another revolution in Mexico. This one came under the auspices of two men that we probably know from funny movies. One's name was Pancho Villa, and the other's name was Emilio Zapata. Both rebels against the tyranny of the Catholic Church and the tyranny of the Mexican government. Pancho Villa and Emilio Zapata were both men like Benito Juarez who tried to bring back Protestantism and those principles to Mexico. For a time they succeeded. A new constitution was written in 1917. One article, Article 27, banned the Catholic Church from owning, acquiring, or administering real property. Article 3 banned the Church from establishing or directing schools of primary education. Article 5 outlawed monastic orders and restricted the number of the clergy. The right to freedom of speech, granted to all ordinary Mexicans, was denied to clerics or to religious leaders. No priest could criticize national laws or any government authority. In the late 1920s, continued repression of the church led to the Cristerio Rebellion. I don't know, folk, I hope you're seeing the war between Protestantism and Catholicism. It went back and forth. From the 1800s, early 1800s, all the way down till right here, we're right now in the 1930s. And it went back and forth. Protestantism, Catholicism. Protestantism, Catholicism. Back and forth as God tried to bring Protestant principles to Mexico. In this Cristerio Rebellion in the late 1920s, Catholic fanatics attacked and destroyed government institutions. 50,000 people lost their lives. This rebellion resulted in the closure of every Catholic church in the country of Mexico. This rebellion eventually flickered out, but the anti-religious provisions of the 1917 Constitution remained, and those remained all the way up until 1979, when Pope John Paul II visited Mexico. I want you to watch. The Cristerio Rebellion was in the late 1920s. By 1991, 12 years ago, Mexico's Congress approved an amendment to the 1917 Constitution allowing state recognition of the Catholic Church. The church regained the right to own property under the new law, and priests were given the right to vote. In 1992, Mexico restored full diplomatic relations with the Vatican. What went on? Late 1920s, the Cristerio Rebellion, the Catholic Church, they're banned, their churches are closed throughout Mexico. 1930, all the way up to 1990. What happened? How is it that it could go from banning the Catholic Church and 60 years later, they're saying the churches can open up, priests can vote now? What's happened? The same thing that happened in America. People in leadership positions began to be given, would we call them loans? They began to be slipped money if they would vote for certain things. And over a period of years, the Jesuit order and the Catholic Church, slowly but surely, began to gain every person in high positions of politics in Mexico. They began to put them in their hip pocket. And they controlled them by the money that they were giving to them. The same thing happened in America in the 1830s, all the way through when the second Constitution in America was written after the Civil War. By July of 2000, when Vicente Fox became president of Mexico, he further closed the gap between the Mexican Church, the Catholic Church, and the Mexican state. Vicente Fox visited the Pope at the Vatican only a few months after taking office, and in July of this year became the first Mexican leader to attend a public papal ceremony when he was present at the canonization of Juan Diego at the Basilica of the Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico City. During the ceremony, Vicente Fox knelt to kiss the papal ring, provoking newspaper cartoonists to harshly lampoon the gesture. But the close linking of the presidency to the church didn't damage Fox politically. His popularity remains generally high. Why did Vicente Fox, a few months after coming into office, why did he, like George Bush, take a European trip? Why did they end up, for some reason, in Vatican City? Is it because they wanted to thank the Pope personally for putting them into office? Think about it. From the 1930s, the early 1930s, and the Cristero Rebellion, up until the year 2000, because direct combat did not work to take over Mexico, they used bribery, infiltration. They used money and blackmail to bring about a situation so that 70 years later, by the year 2000, Vicente Fox could acknowledge and be happy, could go visit the Vatican, and could tell John Paul how much he appreciated his help in becoming president of Mexico. And as Revelation 17 and verse 2 says, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. Through the working out of the Jesuit order, through various means in Mexico, Mexico is just one of those countries